In 415 BC, Athens launched an assault on the city of Syracuse. It required an army of 50,000 men and a fleet, making it the greatest naval operation the Greek world had ever seen. Of that massive force, absolutely no one returned. At the time this fleet set sail, the Athenian Empire was already deeply entangled in the Peloponnesian War, a brutal conflict against Sparta that had dragged on for 15 years. The empire's military resources and manpower were already stretched to their absolute breaking point, yet the political leadership in Athens eagerly approved this massive new campaign. There was no strategic necessity driving them. It was an unwarranted gamble, built on arrogance, that risked the survival of their entire empire. The target, Syracuse, sat on the island of Sicily, operating far outside the traditional Athenian sphere of influence. This vintage map of ancient Sicily illustrates the geographic reality the Athenians ignored. Their leaders possessed completely inadequate knowledge of its immense size and unforgiving terrain. Furthermore, being hundreds of miles from Greece meant the invading army would be entirely cut off from resupply. To fund and support the operation, Athens relied heavily on promises of money and military aid from Sicilian cities hostile to Syracuse. The troops sailed under the assumption this aid was waiting for them. It did not exist. A careful study of the intelligence reports available at the time clearly outlined the danger, but Athenian planners brushed those warnings aside. Before the fleet even cleared the harbor, the operation was doomed by a vacuum of facts. The Athenians had built a lethal trap out of their own overconfidence. The expedition was jointly led by Alcibiades, widely considered the most brilliant yet erratic military commander in Athens. His initial strategy was to cruise the Sicilian coast, stopping at various ports to demand support. While he secured a naval base, the Gaules gave the Syracusans ample warning to prepare their defenses and call in their allies. Then, a sudden domestic scandal struck a fatal blow to the campaign. Alcibiades was abruptly recalled to Athens to face criminal charges of impiety. The accusations were highly specific. He was charged with knocking the faces and fallacies off religious statues, like the one seen here, in Athens. Unwilling to face a trial and probable execution, Alcibiades fled. He defected directly to Sparta, Athens' mortal enemy, and began feeding them valuable military advice on how to crush his former troops. This single act of treachery robbed the expedition of its most capable leader and turned a severely flawed offensive into a fatal two-front war. Command now fell squarely on Nicias. He was a deeply cautious man, far less forceful than Alcibiades, and entirely unsuited for leading an aggressive overseas campaign. Instead of attacking decisively, Nicias settled for a prolonged blockade of Syracuse. This loss of momentum gave Sparta the time they needed to send a relief expedition under a highly capable commander named Gylippus. Gylippus neutralized the Athenian strategy, directing the construction of counterwalls extending from the city, physically blocking Nicias from encircling Syracuse. Forced out by these walls, the massive Athenian army abandoned the high ground to camp in low-lying coastal swamps. The conditions were horrific. The troops were highly prone to fever and sickness. A skirmish claimed the life of another Athenian commander, Lamachus, while Nicias himself was struck down by illness and became bedridden. Reinforcements eventually arrived under a new general, Demosthenes, but the situation was already critical. The arrival of Spartan and Corinthian ships meant the Athenians had lost their supremacy at sea. By abandoning aggressive tactics for a passive siege, the Athenians allowed the enemy to dictate the conduct of the war, leaving themselves stranded in hostile territory. By the summer of 413 BC, the breaking point arrived. Demosthenes saw the campaign was hopeless and demanded the army raise the siege and evacuate immediately, while the sea route was still barely open. Nicias refused to retreat. He clung to the wishful thinking that he could use Athenian money to bribe factions inside Syracuse to surrender the city. A full month passed waiting for a betrayal that never came. More Spartan reinforcements poured onto the island until Demosthenes finally forced the sickly Nicias to order an immediate withdrawal. But on the exact night the army prepared to move to the ships, a full lunar eclipse occurred. According to the historian Thucydides, Nicias was a man somewhat over-addicted to divination. He convinced his terrified troops the eclipse portended a disaster and decreed they must wait the thrice 9 days prescribed by the local soothsayers before moving. The army's only chance of survival required immediate, decisive military action. Instead, tens of thousands of men sat paralyzed by the superstitious weakness of their commander. While the Athenians waited on the moon, the Spartans decisively sealed the trap. Gylippus blocked the mouth of the harbor by chaining a line of ships together, cutting off any hope of escape by sea. Trapped against the coast, the desperate army split into 2 land divisions under Nicias and Demosthenes, abandoning their sick and wounded to attempt an escape into the Sicilian interior. The Syracusans and their Spartan allies were waiting for them. Both divisions were entirely wiped out, and their commanders were taken and executed. The remaining 7,000 survivors were taken prisoner and thrown into the deep stone quarries, condemned to forced labor that ended in death. A force of 50,000 men was erased. Bad intelligence, political treachery, and a fatal delay destroyed the greatest expedition the Greek world had ever seen, marking the permanent end of Athens as a great power. How different might the world be if a commander had simply ignored the soothsayers and sailed home?